have such a condensed program for you that every minute practically is precious. Although, of course, that will never happen, that we will use every minute in that way. But still, we will try to do our best. There is a lot to set the ground for. We'll not worry about doing it very systematically, because one of the things that we are talking about is that the world is based on consciousness, and consciousness is definitely not machine-like. We don't worry about machine type of efficiency. That being said, though, we do set our goals. So at this very initial session, I will set some goals of what is this about? Why do we have a special need for a transformational education? But even before then, let me give you a little bit of sense of accomplishment. That is also very important, which is that, okay, let's go over the basics of why use the quantum worldview, why use quantum physics for setting this background. The whole point is that there is already many places where you can go for transformational education. We are definitely not the only one. We are not claiming that. We are claiming something very specific, which is very important to comprehend. That if we do it on the basis of science, and quantum science is the clearest of the science which has these aspects that spiritual traditions talk about, and transformational education throughout the ages has been about. Quantum science is the one place where we find basically a congruence that is equally surprising, of course very unexpected, and extremely gratifying. Because now finally, all these millennia, we can settle these differences between wisdom traditions, religion, social reformers, all the different isms that people set up from their good wish, but usually they end up to be personality cults, because after the person passes away, they disappear. They were arbitrary, and so long as the person was alive, his personality held the thing together. After that, they make no sense to other people. Other people have different ideas, and they bring different ideas in the offing, and that's what happens. So, can we have a tradition that will have a continuity in such a way that all these differences between different traditions also will disappear? The tradition of science has done that. Tradition of science for the last 400 years has shown that many people with many different ideas can work together under the same umbrella, because there is an arbiter eventually. Eventually, the debates will be settled by experimental data, and the experimental data even will be modified time to time to face up with new situations and new data, but science will do that. So the power of science has already been demonstrated. We don't need to do any further battle that, okay, how do you know that science is the best vehicle to take to settle all these disputes and differences? Okay? Any questions at this point? Okay. So, and then why quantum science can settle these issues? What is the reason that we use quantum science? This is very, very important. Now, some of you, or most of you actually, are already quite prepared. So I apologize to you to repeat some of this stuff. But some of you, maybe one or two, have not had, right? There are one or two who is still a little bit squishy about the basics of quantum physics. Okay, don't need to raise your hand. I don't want to expose you. Be confident. It's okay. All right. So quantum physics fundamentally makes a statement this is not universally accepted statement, but it's very substantial. We can substantiate it. And the statement is that the consciousness is the ground of all being. And the second statement that can be made very confidently, all objects of experience. Yeah, why is this wobbly? Good. All objects of experience. Good. Yeah, still a little wobbly. Are quantum possibilities. I think this is probably workable. Okay, so number one, number two. Objects include material objects and other objects of experience too. So we open this up. Quantum possibilities for consciousness, abbreviation to choose from. Okay? Okay? Number three. What happens when choice occurs? With choice, this consciousness is the ground of being, and all objects are possibilities for consciousness to choose from, is implying already that all objects are possibilities of consciousness itself. Otherwise, how could consciousness choose? So any objects of potentiality are potentiality of consciousness itself to choose from. Obviously, otherwise consciousness cannot choose from somebody else's possibility, right? So consciousness is one with the possibilities. So that domain that we are talking about, that domain of potentiality is a domain of unity. With choice, the domain of potentiality which is a unity. Okay, unity meaning all objects are potentialities of consciousness itself. There is nothing but consciousness. So it is oneness, right? There is nothing but consciousness. So the domain is unity, which is unity. What happens to the unity? It breaks up. Breaks up into a subject looking at an object. And then we discuss what then is the similarity with the traditions, spiritual traditions. And what then is the difficulty that scientists have, traditional scientists have with it, and what is the difficulty that religions have with it. And of course, the difficulties also will face the common person too in some respects, but we can come to that later. So there's all kinds of difficulties there will be. But Can we start with this premise? If there is any question about any of these points, please speak up. Yeah, please.
That is one of the basic premise of how it works going forward. So if you just could explain this once.
Okay, so why subject-object? Now this is where the structure has to come into some details. The unity, splitting up unity means what? This is where you have to get to the crux of the matter. Breaking up unity, how is that experienced? After all, it is a science of our experience, and we break up unity. How is it experienced? Now remember, people who are not taking the context that we have to develop a science of experience, they will just concentrate on the objects, and they will miss the subject entirely, and they may also have a prejudice that there is no such thing as a subject. But if unity tries to break up, then it has to break up at least in two, right? There is any question about it. If unity breaks up into just one thing, then it's not breaking up. It has to break up in two. And what is a sensible breakup? What is our experience? When it does break up, we are positing a metaphysics before it breaks up. Then we are saying this metaphysics will explain our experience. What is our experience? How do we experience the world? Do we experience the world as an object, or do we experience the world as categorically different from the object? This is the question. We experience the world as a subject, categorically different from the object, right? Anybody has any doubt that the subject is different from the object?
Sir, I think one of the interesting confusions is that the subject who's doing the experience, who's getting the experience of the object, thinks of itself as an objective entity. And that's why people talk so much about that everybody's experience should be same if the object is same. That they think they are objective. So the subject itself thinks it is object.
Yeah, that is of course could be a problem. If subject itself thinks that it's an object, and it may not even be thinking. There may be processes where there is reason for the subject to think that it is an object. Okay? So that's a good point. Remember that point. But still, it has to be breaking up in two. And if it breaks up in the same category, then it's not two. It's just one. And that is impossible. So it has to be not impossible, just makes no sense. Because why a unity would break up in objects which are separate, but basically one category of objects? Makes much less sense that it will break up into one part that experiences the other part. Okay? And that's how we experience the world. There is at least this much has to be given, that I can experience the world. There is an I that experiences the world. Of course, there could be that the I thinks that it experiences, or it may be that I objectifies itself and thinks of itself as a me. That could also be. So all these possibilities are okay with me. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is the straightforward point that we can make if we listen to the traditions especially. This is what the traditions say. All wisdom traditions say that that's how the world manifests. So that's one support. So listen to all of this. Consciousness is the ground of all being. All wisdom traditions agree with this. This part is what we are putting in from quantum physics to set the background of this. But the first and third proposition are two propositions with which all wisdom traditions agree, that there is a trinity. Ground of being, splitting up into a subject that looks at an object. Okay? And therefore, we say that there is a good prospect here that we are integrating science and spirituality. So this is one point of integration. There's a second point of integration. And this point is also very, very important. We know from science that for gross material objects, bulk objects, we cannot do any better, huh? It's very wobbly. Bulk material objects behave according to Newtonian physics. Approximately. This is also a scientific fact even of quantum physics. Quantum physics agrees that yes, bulk material objects behave according to Newtonian physics, deterministic physics. Let's make that very clear. Newton gave equations of movement for objects, and Newtonian physics can predict the movement of objects every moment of occurrence. It's a predictable theory. Everything is determined according to that theory. And quantum physics agrees that bulk matter, like the brain, like our human body, they are objects that obey Newtonian physics approximately. So the problem arises when consciousness deals with bulk matter like the brain or the human body, or even as small as a living cell. That is still bulk enough for quantum effects not to be very important. So a very big question is that the states of these systems, bulk material systems, can those states be described as quantum possibility, wave of quantum possibility, a bunch of quantum possibilities that will behave like a wave? Obviously the answer should be no. Oh, hi, good to see you. The answer should be no. Agreed?
This term that you have introduced just now is the bulk. So when do we start calling a particle as a bulk material object? Because that is what will define your question, or that is what in my mind.
But that is not so
So
important.
is an electron a bulk physical object? When the wave collapses into a actuality, does it become a bulk? No, not yet. So when does it, or when do we call it as a gross as opposed to subtle?
Okay, this is another question which is much too detailed. Let's postpone it. But there is no doubt that where there is bulk, that brain and the human body satisfies the definition of bulk. There is no doubt about it. Okay, so let's postpone that question.
So
we are talking about microbes and stuff, and then there is some leeway.
Yeah. So the chemical reactions happening at the cellular level, they are still the bulk reactions.
Maybe, may not be.
Okay.
There is lot of question here that has to be gotten into.
Okay.
So then a big question comes. Then this is a big question that has to be answered from the beginning. So consciousness the way it interacts with anything, any of its objects, is through choice from possibilities. But if the objects are already in a state where the possibilities are determined, Newtonian possibilities, they are determined already, so there is nothing for consciousness to choose. It's just a formality. Consciousness still chooses, but it is forced to choose the same state. There is no way that it can interact really with matter, because there is none of that wavy structure in the material. It has become virtually Newtonian. Yes, the center of mass can still have a little bit of quantum movement, but center of mass, as you know, is conceived of a particle that exists where all the mass is concentrated. That's the way to think of the center of mass of an object. So that object has quantum, and consciousness can choose where the position of the center of mass will be. But consciousness has nothing to say about the relative movement of the particles of the object, or components of the object about the center of mass. Consciousness has nothing to say. How does it interact then with the internal states of big objects? Did you get that? This is a little bit of physics involved here, because a big object will have a center of mass, and then all the components will be moving about the center of mass. And this movement we call relative movement. So movement of center of mass, and then we have relative movement. Relative movement of the components about the center of mass. Okay? What's the question?
Sir, this center of mass.
Yeah, center of mass is the point where all the mass is centered. We can, for every bulk object, we can think of a center of mass. It's called the balance point. Like anything can be balanced on a finger, right? That's the place we can think of as if it's a particle with all the mass in the particle. Okay, but then rest of the body doesn't go away. We can still ask the question, what is the movement of this other component of the body about the center of mass?
Around the nucleus it is.
Well, nucleus is, for example. Okay, so this relative movement is what really is important for the internal state of the object. So when we say that brain is having a state of movement, what do we mean? We don't mean the movement of center of mass in space. That's irrelevant for brain's behavior. The brain's behavior is basically how is the different components of the brain, how is their movement about the center of mass of the brain, right? And what I'm saying is that movement is basically Newtonian. There is no quantum there. And so the big question of philosophy or science, which is also a scientific question, is how does consciousness then connect to this movement? Connect to the relative movement inside the brain. Because it's a relative movement inside the brain that is what is causing brain's behavior, right? How does the brain's neocortex, how does the brain's neurons, how does the brain's amygdala, all those things behave. That's what determines overall experience that we have connected with the brain, right? It is those things that are important. And how does consciousness have anything to say about that? This is a legitimate question. The answer is extremely important for us to understand. So we are giving the answer that consciousness does it via quantum subtle bodies. Subtle potentialities. To the relative movement inside the gross. I just write gross, but remember whenever we say gross, we mean this relative movement inside the gross.
Sir, you said that consciousness is a quantum subtle possibilities in comparison to the Newtonian movement.
The subtle possibilities are quantum. If consciousness can connect to the subtle possibilities, and then subtle possibilities connect to the brain, or connect to the body, then the problem is solved, because the subtle possibility. One more comment. An example of this is important. How do we measure, for example, the movement of an electron? You all know that electron can be seen with electron microscope, electron can be seen with a Geiger counter. So what do? We use the Geiger counter. This is an electron detector to measure the electron. How is consciousness connecting to the Geiger counter? Geiger counter is a big object. Because the electron's connection to the Geiger counter makes the Geiger counter a temporary quantum device. What's the role of the Geiger counter? It will make a memory of the electron's action. And in that way, the Geiger counter is called a measuring device, because it makes a memory of how the electron acted. But Geiger counter measures electron how? Same problem we have now. How does consciousness connect to the Geiger counter? Consciousness is connecting to the Geiger counter because Geiger counter has become temporarily quantum because it's coupled to quantum. And this is what happens to gross matter. When gross matter is coupled to subtle matter, it's not subtle matter, subtle objects, or it becomes temporarily quantum. It acquires a temporary quantum behavior. Okay? You see the analogy?
The inner behavior is quantum, and that is the actual behavior, but it is being expressed as a Newtonian behavior outside. And
No, that is not quite what we are saying. We are saying that the inner behavior is in the okay, it's a little bit of a difficult proposition to understand. We have to go into a little more detail, which I did not want to go into right now. But this is, look, we have to make these advanced statements. All of you have come to quantum activism workshop, and we do not go into such details because such details are not important to get the essence. But here we got to face the details because we are preparing leaders and teachers of these things, and people will ask you this kind of question, especially people who are experts in quantum physics, don't doubt it, and you have to answer them. And therefore this detail is a bit premature, but still let's go into it. What is a wave? What is a wave? A wave has to be described as something that waves, right? Something that waves. What is waving here? My position of my hand. It's a hand waving, right? With space, my hand is waving, right? See that? Position of the hand is varying as a function of space, right? Similarly, we can say that when a water wave expands in crest lines, which is how we see the water wave, what happens if we look at every point of the water as the wave is passing by? Sometimes the point will be up when a crest line is passing it. In between, the water position will be, the molecule's position will be down when the crest has passed it by. So what will be if I plot the position against time or space? Position of water molecules or we call it disturbance. Disturbance is the general name that we give to that. So disturbance varies with time goes to a maximum, goes to a minimum, goes to a maximum, and this is the level of water. We can see that. We can see if we put a cork on the water, the cork will go up, and then again it will come to the level, and then it will reach the what we call trough, go down below the level water, and that's what we call a wave. If you look at a guitar string, the same kind of behavior. The particles of the string will go up. You can see this visually. And then go down, and the level, of course, is the normal position of the string. Is it making sense? Okay? This is not hard to understand. And so, we say that when we talk about quantum behavior, it specifically means that the waves will be addable in algebraic manner. Like if two waves come at a place in this way, then the total wave, total disturbance would be I should have done it separately like this. Okay, the total will be I'm not drawing it very well. Let's try it again. I should make it smaller. Okay. And I have another wave. But this is called waves in phase because look where the crest here, the same crest is here. The trough. I did not draw it very well, but assume it, okay? Then we get something like this. Another wave which is augmented wave, okay? But if two waves are like this, then the waves will cancel each other out. So what is happening, what I'm trying to say is that the waves add algebraically. Okay? And this is called a coherent superposition. This is the word that I'm looking for. Coherent superposition. So when you say wave, this is what it means. It means that the consciousness can choose out of these coherent superpositions. And it is this choice, this ability for coherent superposition is what makes quantum effects measurable. We'll talk about that later when we talk about double slit experiments, but I don't want to do that right now. I want to do that in the afternoon. Okay? This is why I was trying to avoid this discussion. But since you asked, and there is a conceptual gap here, that is how do we know that the internal movement is Newtonian or quantum? This is how we know. There can be individual elementary particles, elementary objects in the brain. And their individual behavior, of course, will be still quantum. But there is no coherence among the individual behavior of a molecule, let's say, in the neocortex with another molecule in the another apparatus like the amygdala. There's no coherence in their movement. So the overall behavior has no quantum coherence for the overall mathematical function that will describe the brain that we can call a quantum behavior. Okay? I know things are getting a little bit complex here because mathematics comes in. We cannot completely avoid it. And then, of course, the question is what is the correspondent of disturbance. That we will have to discuss at some point also. Make sense? It did. If microphone.
I just wanted this to be clarified again, that so this is the coherence. So consciousness has the capacity to choose whether to be coherent or not.
No, consciousness can choose only if there is coherence. In other words, when we say that a possibility wave is a bundle of possibility, we are simplifying a bit too much. A quantum wave is a coherent bundle of possibilities, a bundle of coherent possibilities. Okay? That coherent possibility is an all-important word. Coherent superposition of possibilities. This phrase, when I was writing my popular book, I had to debate for nights whether to introduce the concept of coherent superposition or not. Because it is, after all, a very mathematical but there is no option, because it is a detail that you should know, and this is a university. If we don't teach such things, then you will be vulnerable. But we'll come back to it again in the afternoon when I talk about double slit experiment. Okay? I apologize that I have to introduce a little bit of mathematical concept once in a while.
Sir, it's a wonderful statement that consciousness can choose only if there is coherence. That is why our rishis, they have already always tried to achieve coherence, so that consciousness they can make to choose.
Well, that
Is to achieve coherence.
yeah, that's a very general statement. So we have to be a little bit careful about. But yes, generally speaking, coherence. We need coherence because then we have this possibility that if it's a quantum coherence, then we have this additional possibility that we couple to consciousness. Okay, very good.
So just one small sentence again. So the coherence is the crests and crests together, or and also the crests and troughs together, or is it only
No, they're
means the straight line as well as the double line? Are both the things
Yeah,
detectable by the quantum instruments?
Yeah, the two waves where the crest line appears at the same places and the trough appears at the same places, that's one thing can happen. But in other places, the crest and trough can appear opposite. So that's also coherence. Coherence is the definite phase relationship exists between the two waves. It's not that crest has to appear everywhere, the other crest has to appear, not that way. Then there will be only reinforcement. But we do find that when two waves mingle together, then the superposition will not produce just enhancement. Some places enhancement, but some places a different distance. I'll come back in the afternoon. It will be more clear when we do the interference.
So both are
experiment.
called coherence. Both are called coherence, no?
No, because, please stop, because
Okay.
I think we are boring the rest of the audience. This is details. So we'll get into more details in the afternoon.
So just one point, in fact, what you talked about, the consciousness can choose from coherent quantum possibilities, quantum waves of possibilities. I think this explains one key gap which I had in understanding of how the vital bodies function. Because I think the vital bodies are the place where this first the coherence happens, the superposition happens, and then consciousness chooses from that. So it's not unlimited possibilities, but the coherent possibility.
Yeah, we simplify. This simplification is a huge problem, because when we simplify away crucial things, and then it's not very clear anymore that what we're talking about. So when we say bundle of possibilities, these words I have used in all my books, they were very familiar, that a quantum wave or a quantum possibility is a bundle of different potential, bundle of different facets, a bundle of different positions, for example, for an electron, or for a thought wave, bundle of different meanings. But now we are modifying it. We are saying that no, not just any bundle, but a coherent bundle of coherent meanings. That coherent is a very important addition, because that coherence is what enables quantum behavior to be measured. Without that coherence, quantum behavior exists but cannot be measured. And then it's a moot point. If the measurability is gone, it's a moot point, because consciousness is not being able to choose unless it is expressible as a coherent superposition of the possibilities. Then only it. If incoherence enter, we call it decoherence. Coherence has been gotten rid of. This word decoherence is something that people will often use. So the entire argument goes like this. The internal waves of different components of the brain, they would not be coherent with each other, because a decoherence has taken place in the process of making macro from micro objects. Everybody agrees that we are making the macro object from elementary particles to atoms to molecules, etc. Right? But in the process, this coherence is replaced by what we call decoherence. The coherence goes away. And this is the definition of really how quantum behavior becomes Newtonian behavior. Okay? Many repetition will be necessary before you get this point. So go and get disheartened if you are not getting it. Okay? So, a possibility wave then might as well complete this line of argument is a coherent superposition, coherent superpositions of different facets. Okay. This is what we mean by a possibility wave in general. Although strictly speaking, this is a wave bundle, or we, literally speaking, we should use the word technically, word packet. This is how objects appear. They are a packet of waves. Packet of what? Packet of coherent superposition of facets or waves. I know I am losing him. All because of you. No, I'm kidding. We have to go through such stuff, because this is the difference between workshop and coming to a university class. I stayed up this morning and debated whether to do it honestly or not, but then I thought, look, one of the reasons that you are here is to face up to the fact of we have to stay honest to the outside world. If we want to convince and change the world, we cannot go over things just lightly. Although it will tax your brain sometimes in enormous amount, but still we have to struggle with it and get it. Okay, but now let's come back to the main thread. Main thread was here. I said Geiger counter, when Geiger counter couples to the electron, Geiger counter picks up enough quantum behavior to make a memory of that electron's position. So the Geiger counter will then show me where the electron was. Okay? So similarly, then what is happening? Consciousness couples through subtle and to the gross. And guess what? Every wisdom tradition has taught like this. They say, call this the causal body, because cause, that choice is coming from consciousness, and they call this intermediate quantum potentialities the source of our experiences of thinking, feeling, and intuition. To be explicit, they are calling this the subtle body, and the reason for calling them the subtle body will be clear in a minute, and I'll come to that immediately. And the matter is the gross body. Okay? Every spiritual tradition talks like this. Hinduism is very explicit, but every wisdom tradition talks like this. And this is a tremendous agreement of wisdom tradition, quantum physics. Quantum physics is justifying this aspect of wisdom tradition. Okay? So because of these agreements, the fair statement that quantum physics integrates science and spirituality can be made. Why? Once we understand this, then we have understand both aspects. Look at what happened. The first proposition was how consciousness divides, right? And the last proposition is how we go back. How we go back is through the subtle. The unity breaks up into a subject and an object, and then the subject will be a representation in some material body only, right? The world that we see around us in space and time, that world is world of matter. There's no doubt about that. Materialists make a very good point. They just talk about this world. That's all. They forget that there could be other things that influences this world. That's the part they forget. But they are not wrong. Nobody is wrong whose work is backed up by experimental data. But they can be incomplete. This is the point. Scientists have found very good description of the gross matter level of reality. Okay? It's just that their model is all phenomenon that we are talking about that's outside of gross matter, we don't need. Everything is already in gross matter, and that's all there is. Whatever is already there in gross matter, their proposition is that is all there is. Our proposition is no, what is happening in the gross matter, that is not all there is. There are other things that has happened and that has changed gross matter, and those changes come from these domains. If that is true, then what can we say? We can say that, aha, if we have use of these levels of reality, then we can change what is in the gross matter. See the difference? If we say that gross matter is all there is, then we become limited in how gross matter can change. Because all gross matter can change is just gross matter's interaction with gross matter. I can change you, boom. I put a force and you change. We can do it that way. But there is very little change that we can affect that way. Whereas, if gross matter has been changed in subtle ways by other things that is external to gross matter, and if we can also access them, that is, we are not just gross matter, but we can also access these, then our scope of the science that we have goes up enormously. Because if subtle matter is quantum, then we immediately get the idea, infinite potentiality. Right? This word infinite potentiality has gotten very popular, and rightfully so. We have infinite potentialities to change what we have in gross matter. Now I use a very, very simple language to explain this. So, quantum view of the world. This word living is very special in quantum view of the world. We don't have any qualms with the materialists as far as non-living matter is concerned. What's the difference? Non-living matter is something that consciousness has no representation in. Consciousness represents itself as a subject only in living matter. Only living matter has experience. This subject-object split. Subject comes from consciousness. That conscious experience is specific to only living matter. Yeah.
But even for the non-living matter, we have this idea of a field which I suppose is actually in the quantum.
We can couple them to quantum, and then remember non-living matter, Geiger counter, became quantum in connection with the electron. So similarly, if we couple vital energy to non-living matter, then non-living matter will temporarily become a little bit of quantum.
The living consciousness can couple with the non-living matter to
Via
make
the subtle energies.
Yeah.
So if a person lives in a house, what happens? The objects in the house become correlated with the person's vital energy, and then if another person sits there, they can feel the vital energy of this person that lived there. It's very clear if you go to Ramana Maharshi's great place in Tiruvannamalai and sit in his cave, you will have a very good meditation. Yeah, please. Turn it on.
Okay, so, and what about the behavior, like crystals, in this way? Is the same, because some crystals have kind of a subtle power,
Yeah.
don't they? Is the same explanation you gave, or could
Yeah,
it something-
any time that we are noticing that a non-living matter has taken up some aspects of consciousness or what we attribute to consciousness, then it is because that the certain subtle energies have become coupled with it. Yeah. Now here is a genuine difference between wisdom traditions, some wisdom traditions, and quantum physics, what quantum physics is saying. And this is very important for us to notice. There will be many such differences with wisdom traditions. Why is this very important? Because it is, as I said, wisdom traditions were developed by peoples, mostly peoples are good opinions. In some cases they came from intuition, but in most cases they just figured things out by rational argument, just as we do today. And rational argument will always depend on the basic assumptions that we make. One of the basic assumptions that the wisdom traditions tend to make is that they generalize too much. They are very prone to make the statement that everything is divine. Very confusing statement anyway, because everything in our experience appears to be not so divine because it's separate. It's not clearly unity. But we can very easily confuse that they are talking about in the manifest world, objects in the manifest world as well. I remember in my childhood, I was really very confused because nobody explained to me until I had my own discovery. Nobody I talked to explained to me that the unity refers to another domain of reality. Although if I myself were very intelligent and read the original mystical text very carefully, then I probably would have found it. But I didn't, and that probably is good because that way I could discover that truth directly by myself. And I think that is a better way of discovering things. This is why some ignorance is actually good. But you see what I'm getting at. This gross statements that you read, everything is conscious. Yeah? You have read such statements, you remember? Like people when they talk about ecology. Why should we take care of our ecosystem? They say, well, everything is divine. They're putting the stones and the biota in the same category. What we should be very careful? We should be very careful in preserving the biota. That's part of consciousness. That part of the reality which connects to consciousness directly. But the rocks, the non-living, that's a different category. Yes, they support the living, so they are also important in the sense that they form the abode of the living, but it's not the same thing. Okay? These understandings, subtle understandings, will be very different for us, will be very important for us, because we will have to talk about how ecological concerns are taken care of by our modern quantum leaders. Yes, please.
Sir, you just differentiated between the rock and the biomatter, living and non-living, and it is different. But energies and consciousness has collapsed its possibility of becoming a rock, and consciousness has collapsed its possibility of an organism. Consciousness is involved in both. Supposing in my home, if my refrigerator is feeling unloved, it becomes non-functional. So I send it energy and it becomes functional. Mr. Anil Sinha.
Consciousness collapses the possibility of a rock for sure, but consciousness does not get represented in the rock. Rock does not have a subjective experience.
But what about the refrigerator?
Same thing. Refrigerator does not have a subjective experience.
But then why does it improve on when I give it love? If it's not functioning, if my refrigerator or my machine is not functioning, and I give love to it, it behaves nicely. If I start...
You mean, can you love a refrigerator?
This is the experiment which we have done, and it has shown.
Okay, tell me the experiment.
Can I hand the mic over to Mr. Anil, if you'll allow me?
Yeah, actually, I think she's talking about that experiment which I have done, where somebody was experiencing this breakdown in his plants, in his generator and his, in one particular generator, and no technical problem, no technical, service was able to solve it. And as a part of the coaching that I was doing for them, so I was trying to shift their understanding from a consciousness perspective for all their experience of their business problems. And so one of the things was this generator thing, and when during the course of my talking to them, I discovered that this generator was actually a second-hand generator which they bought from outside. And although technically it was all very good, but then it was doing this mysterious erratic behavior. And I told them that this generator is feeling unloved, and then I gave them some affirmation things, and they worked with it, and miraculously after that, now for 1 year the generator is running fine, and there was no breakdown. And I tried to explain it as a consciousness experience, but I think what you are saying, it does not really contradict that. And that's what I think the confusion that Vandana has.
Let's pick this subject when we discuss in the evening.
Yeah,
This
okay.
would be a good subject to talk about. Okay, but this is a very important distinction, and remember it, because this distinction of living and non-living is a major scientific importance. Okay, if we don't make this distinction, we become very lousy scientists, because we would be specifically then contradict with just straightforward scientific perception of the world. For science, it's extremely important to define what life is. We have now found a quantum definition of life. What is life? Life is the first material conglomeration of material objects where consciousness can be represented as a subject, which can experience the rest of the world as its objects of experience. This is what a living cell does. Living cell has an integrity. A rock does not have an integrity. You superimpose some mud on the rock, rock doesn't care. But a living cell preserves its integrity, because that integrity has experience. It has an identity that is called self-identity. It has a self. And this self comes from consciousness. See the difference? And this difference is vitally important. Material scientists can never define life because they don't have the base that we have. Consciousness is the ground of being. And then don't worry about the fact that, so I'm losing one of my pet propositions of spiritual traditions. That's okay. Traditions were built by human beings, and human beings are fallible. One of the big problems of religions is that they have introduced propositions which are simply dubious, like infallibility. So we have to give up some of the very pet theories that religions especially have. Wisdom traditions usually do not talk about infallibility, but sometimes they do. And that too then we have to abandon. Some of the pet principles of these traditions have to be given up. Okay? For example, this idea that reality is what it is. Now we are discovering that no, reality is differentiable only because there is a level of reality where there is only potentiality of objects and subjects, and then there is another reality where things are manifest. This distinction is vague in spiritual traditions. This distinction is complete, understood, and exploited in the quantum worldview. In this way, although quantum worldview is integrating science and spirituality, but it also can be used to discern between various wisdom traditions and gotten rid of those subjects of contention. Not all traditions would say blanket statements like all objects are divine. Only certain traditions do that. Other traditions are very clear that there is a distinction between living and non-living. So, now I'll make the fundamental difference between the matter view of the world and the quantum view of the world. matter view of the world is that all phenomena are material phenomena, period. Caused by matter moving in space and time and interaction between matter. But all phenomena that we have, including our experiences, they are all material phenomena, coming from interaction of matter moving in space and time. Coming from material interaction in space and time. Okay. So phenomena which are a bit unusual, how would material scientists explain them? They would say some blanket kind of explanation. One explanation that is very popular right now, like how do feelings arise? Feelings are now, people are kind of have many behavioral cognitive experiments that are suggesting that feelings are real. They cannot be really completely ignored anymore. And what do they say? What is the theory of feeling according to materialists? Because computers cannot process feeling. Computers can process part of the mentation or thoughts, the rational part, but the part that is algorithmic, but they cannot at all process feeling. So then what is the justification of feeling? How can they arise? They have a blanket statement, like spiritual, religious traditions have a blanket statement. Anything that you cannot explain, God does it. Similarly, anything that materialists cannot explain, evolution does it. That's a blanket explanation. And what is quantum physics saying? Quantum worldview is saying that yes, what we see in space and time is indeed matter, the gross. This is indeed the case. In space and time, it is the movement of gross, but the gross can be regarded as hardware of computers. This analogy is very powerful. The hardware has software that runs the hardware. Okay. Listen to this carefully and the whole worldview will become perfectly clear to you. Oh my God. So hardware is associated with some software. And who makes the software? Software is made by consciousness. Consciousness makes the software. To represent itself and the subtle. That represent itself appears as the subject, and the representing the when the subtle is represented, then something very specific that is happening, and that creates the camouflage. Because when consciousness has represented the subtle into matter, the software, then this hardware-software combination is still material, right? And that gives the impression that the hardware-software combination, which is material, agreed, that is enough. Who needs to assume that there is consciousness and there is this subtle? We don't use our intelligence very well here, because in actuality our experience with hardware software is very clear. How do we use a computer? Computer does not make its own software. Computer never has done that. Any computer in our world ever has made its software, although we can write the computer in such a way that it can write simple software programs for itself. But we gave it originally. There's no doubt about it for actual computers of the world. But still, scientists hold on to the idea that somehow consciousness programs, computers program these, matter programs itself. Material bodies program itself. Life is a program which arose in material body by itself. Why? That's where evolution. Evolution is such a wonderful device for them. It has become like God was for religion. Everything that you cannot explain, God does it. For the materialist, everything that you cannot explain, evolution does it. No, it's not necessary to do that. Instead, all it is necessary to see in the quantum worldview, it's very, very clear that consciousness makes the software to operate the hardware.
So I think the software itself is, I think, the subtle.
Software is not the subtle. There is the material software too. That's what causes the debate.
In terms of representation.
Yeah, the subtle is played automatically. At this point we have to make more details when we introduce the subtle, which you will do in the second part of the morning. But you see the difference. There is a, like, take the case of mental memory. Right? Mental memory, is there a brain component? Yes, there is a brain component. And that's the problem. There is a brain component and who knows what's in it. And materialists take advantage of it, saying that no, that's all there is. There is nothing else. Whereas our model will be slightly different. What will we say? We say, well, that brain component is the software that consciousness has made, but there is also associated with it a mental memory that's not in the brain. That's part of what we call our mental body. That's a subtle software that is associated with the brain.
So
If I may, extend the analogy of a computer, I think what you are referring to, the software, which is not really the subtle, but it's still gross, is basically the representation of software, let's say, in the memory. But when the software is executed, that is when the meaning comes. And that's where probably it's like that.
That's when the experience will arise, because you will experience the subtle in conjunction with that software.
So when that software starts executing in a particular sequence, as per the algorithm, then that execution itself, it's like the relative movement of the center of mass, as you were saying, it creates the...
Yeah, but that's only for the material part. And then the mental part, the vital part, they will play because they are correlated with it. Now we are getting into concepts that we are not introduced yet. Okay?
So there was this experiment that there was in the randomizer, the random event generator could be influenced by a person's consciousness.
Okay, let's not get into
So how do
this
they
kind
interact?
of thing. Hold your questions a little bit, because there is. Look, we must avoid what happened just now. We must be inclusive. What is happening in this particular session is that only a few people asked a lot of questions. It's wonderful. Look, I'm not trying to shut you up, but I do want to absolutely assure myself how the rest of you are doing. Okay? And there is no way for me to know that unless you speak up. Please. So, we must have a shared experience here. All of us must learn it together. There are many questions here, and questions will occur naturally. They are all very good questions. Everything that everybody asks, all are good questions. Okay? So I'm not suggesting that you don't ask questions. But the kind of question that will be a sidetrack, please take those questions for the discussion session which we'll have every evening. Okay? And here, limit the questions to only what is pertinent to understanding what is being stated. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere. This time is so short. We have 2 days to finish the whole subject of how the integration and how the interface of science and spirituality is taking place. Here is a huge, huge, huge problem to solve. Just imagine the gravity of the situation. The wisdom tradition, the religions, of course, they don't get anywhere because they fight with each other. Who settles this fight? Today the psychologists are having the same problem. Any non-material psychologists, they fight with each other. There is depth psychology, psychoanalysis, Jungian psychology, there is transpersonal psychology. They don't see eye to eye. How can we ever make a post-materialist science if we cannot even agree about basic things? What is the criterion for agreement? What I am saying is that science, this idea of verification by experimental data, gives us a wonderful opportunity of developing a coherent umbrella under which everybody can work. I'm not suggesting that people give up their opinions about things and their own personal way of doing things. That's all fine. But whatever you do has to agree with a certain general ideas that will define the paradigm. This is what is called a paradigm work. Unless we work with paradigms, we cannot really settle these differences. And these differences are killing us because the opponent is very united. The materialist opponent is extremely united, and that's their force. They settle their differences by experimental data and scope of application. Very simple criteria. We can do the same. We have enough scientific knowledge today that we can really do the same. We don't have to do this territoriality. That's the word that my friend Constantine recently used when we were giving a workshop. We are behaving like religions behave. We have defined a territory. No, this is my territory. Don't infringe on my territory. We don't need to do that anymore. Okay? So we have a break, right? Are we ready for a break?